Duberstein, horse specialist at the University of Georgia, and we are finishing up our video series on forage education for horse owners. Our last two videos are going to focus on pasture management. So I'm standing in a field now where we have different species of grass that's growing. We have some grasses, we have some legumes. If you looked at the ground, there'd be clover on the ground. We have some grass that's very tall. We have some grass that's been grazed down very short, and we have a few weeds. So what I want to accomplish in the video today is to give you some pointers on how to establish pasture if you're starting from scratch, types of species that you might consider using in your pasture, either as a perennial pasture or overseeding it onto an existing pasture. I'd like to talk about different types of rotational grazing to try to maximize your grass production, and in general just give you some helpful tips on how to best manage your pasture so that you have grazing for as much of the year as possible. So those are the topics that we're going to go ahead and dive into today. In this video, we're going to discuss how to design and establish a horse pasture, including what types of grass you might want to plant and how to set up your pastures to rotationally graze them. Our main goal in establishing a good pasture is to first effectively provide forage to your horse almost year-round, which would hopefully help to reduce your hay costs, as well as to establish a safe grazing space for your horse with safe forage and as few weeds as possible. In order to do that, we need to start by having enough land for our horses. If we overstock our pastures or keep more horses on them than the land can support, we'll have no luck in getting a good stand of grass to grow. The rule of thumb is that it takes about 2 acres of well-managed pasture to support one horse. Obviously, many farms have more horses per acre than this, but if you do that, you have to more intensively manage your land by keeping horses in stalls part of the day and providing supplemental hay to prevent overgrazing of your pastures. Okay, let's look at this a little closer. Most people want their horse pastures to have a nice stand of grass with almost no weeds. There's lots of ways that we can manage the pastures to help accomplish this, including fertilizing and spraying for weeds. But if we constantly overgraze our pastures, we're never going to accomplish our goals. For a pasture to support a horse, it has to both be able to provide enough dry matter for the horse to eat each day, plus have room and time to regrow as the horse eats it down. If we have a stocking rate that's greater than 1 horse per 2 acres or so, the pasture typically won't be able to do this. What happens is that the horses eat down all the available grass, usually leaving the weeds alone because they taste bad. To understand why this is a problem, we need to look at what happens under the ground when the horse eats the above ground part of the plant. Remember, the leaves above the ground are photosynthesizing to provide nutrients for the entire plant. When the horse eats off those leaves that are above the ground, the roots also die back. So the below ground image of the plant is a mirror image to what you see above the ground. This is a problem if the plant isn't given time to recover after it's been grazed. The roots die back and become very shallow, so they don't take up the water and nutrients that the plant needs to regrow. If we remove the grazing pressure, the plant will grow back and the root structure will grow and deepen again. However, if the plant isn't given enough time to regrow before we graze it again, the roots will continue to get shallower and shallower as the plant is grazed down. The weeds, on the other hand, are being left untouched, so their root structure continues to grow and deepen. That means that they're more adapted to any kind of stress like drought, and this is the reason that weeds are often able to completely overtake our pastures that have been overgrazed. The main way to avoid this is to not overstock your pastures. If you have more horses than your pasture can support, which a lot of people do, consider keeping them in stalls part of the day or creating a sacrifice area where you can keep your horses part of the day and provide an alternative forage like hay. Ideally, you want to set this up where you can rotationally graze your pastures. In a rotational grazing system, horses are kept off the pasture for a portion of time to allow the grass to regrow in that part of the pasture. You would ideally have multiple sections of your pasture, and all of these would be adjacent to your sacrifice area. That way you could rotate your horses from one field to another and give each section of your pasture a chance to regrow. The amount of time that the pasture needs to rest varies a lot based on what time of the year it is. So in the spring, we have a lot of rain and the plants grow quickly, and the pasture might only need to rest for 2 weeks before it grows back up to a point where the horses can graze it. But in the summer, sometimes it gets hot and dry, the grass doesn't grow as quick, and then it takes more than a month or so before that pasture regrows to a point where we want to put the horses back out to graze. In general, you want to put horses out on the pasture when the grass is about 6 to 8 inches tall, and then remove them when they've eaten it down to about 3 to 4 inches. And this can vary a little based on what type of forage you have in your pasture, but it's a really good rule of thumb to consider when you're trying to manage when to graze your horses and when to pull them off of a pasture. Even in pastures that aren't overstocked, rotational grazing can provide benefits and should be considered. Horses are known to be selective grazers, and that means that they will go into certain areas of the pasture and really eat that part down. These would be called the lawns, while they leave other sections of the pasture completely untouched. We call these the roughs. Rotational grazing kind of makes the horses a little bit less picky, and it gives those lawn areas a chance to regrow, and hopefully encourages the horses to eat more uniformly.
What we're looking at here is a relatively large pasture. It's about 8 acres with about 4 horses on it right now. And what I want to show you is that rotational grazing can be implemented in any size pasture. So in this particular example, even though the stocking rate is not high, this is a pasture that will benefit from rotational grazing. If we look at the areas that the horses are currently in, we notice that they've grazed the grass down to the very ground, and what that allows is a lot of bare soil and a lot of rooms for weeds to infiltrate into the grass. If we move over to the area where the horses are fenced out of, what we'll notice is that the grass has gotten both taller and thicker because the horses don't eat it right now, and we have much less bare soil area. And in areas where there are weeds, and there's still some weeds present, what you'll see is that the grass is able to come in and compete with those weeds because it's not being chewed down by the horses. So over time, this type of rotational grazing system will lead to a better grass stand and fewer weeds.
Another big factor that we should talk about today is what type of grass to plant in your pasture. Actually, I keep using the word grass, but it's good to incorporate legumes such as clover into your pasture as well. Legumes fix atmospheric nitrogen, and they bring that down into the soil. So in essence, they provide a little bit of a nitrogen boost for the pasture. This shouldn't take the place of fertilizing, but it can help improve your pasture fertility a little. When you're choosing what grass to use either to establish a new pasture or to overseed an already established pasture, you want to consider diversifying and using more than one forage species. The goal would be to provide forage almost year-round for your horse, so you need to plant different forages that are adapted to different growth periods. Some grasses are considered warm season, meaning that they grow best in the summer months, while some are considered cool season, meaning that they grow best in the fall and spring. It's hard to find a perennial grass that grows in the winter, though we do have some different annuals that might. You want to base your pasture on a few perennial forages. These are the ones that grow back every year without you having to replant them. And then consider overseeding your pasture with an annual to extend the growing season. In Georgia, the main warm season perennials that we have are Bermuda grass and also Bahia grass if you're in southern Georgia. The most common cool season perennial in Georgia is tall fescue. When you're planting a grass, you want to recognize that there are often many seeded varieties of each forage, and in some forage there are also hybrid varieties that you have to sprig. If we look at Bermuda grass, for example, common Bermuda grass is a seed variety, meaning that you can buy seed from a store and then spread this over your pasture to propagate it. Things like Coastal, Russell, Tift 85, and Alicia are all hybrids. Hybrids have sterile seeds, so they have to be sprigged instead of seeded. Sprigs are little pieces of plant material, mainly the roots, that are put into the soil using a special tractor implement. Hybrid varieties have a lot of benefits that might be things like increased yield or improved digestibility for the horse, but they're not that easy for the average horse owner to establish. Most of the Bermuda grass hay fields that you see are sprig varieties, meaning that if you go to buy Bermuda grass hay, you're typically going to buy one of these hybrids. But a lot of our horse pastures are seeded with common Bermuda grass or another seeded variety. That's not to say that you couldn't use a sprig variety in your horse pasture. You just have to make sure you either have the equipment or hire someone who has the equipment to sprig it. When you're seeding a pasture, seed contact with the soil is really important in order to get good germination of that seed. This isn't too hard if you have an area of bare soil like you see here, for example, if you're trying to establish pastures from scratch, but it can be a lot more difficult if you're trying to overseed an already established pasture like this one. Broadcast seeding is easy and it's available to most people at a fairly low cost, either by using something like a tractor seeder or by hand seeding a small area. No-till drilling is another way to overseed a pasture, and it has the advantage of better soil contact because that seed is being put directly into the soil. So that improves your germination rates. But you require a specialized and more expensive tractor implement like you see here. When you're planting forages, you really want to work with your county extension agent to get the best planting times for your area. When you're planting warm season grasses, soil temperature is important. Soil needs to be warm enough for that seed to germinate. Usually these are planted in late spring, but the dates vary based on what part of Georgia you're in. Cool season grasses can typically be planted in early fall or in very early spring. You want to give enough time for that plant to get established before it gets hit by either freezing temperatures or by our hot, dry summers. For those farm owners who want to really aggressively keep grass growing as close to year-round as possible, you might consider planting an annual like ryegrass around October, and that's what you see here. That ryegrass will grow over many of the winter months when the cool season grasses die back. Summer annuals aren't nearly as commonly used in horse pastures, but you might sometimes use them, especially in areas that have been recently cleared, where you might need to establish something quickly to hold the soil in place. The most common summer annual utilized in horse pastures is pearl millet, not brown top millet, but pearl millet. Again, another thing that you want to remember when you're planting a new pasture or when you're overseeding your existing pasture is that it's really important to keep your horses off of it until that new growth gets established. Ideally, you want to keep them off until your new grass gets to about 6 to 8 inches tall, and then allow them to graze it. If you put them on too early, you run the risk of them pulling those plants up by the roots. It takes a little while for those young plants to get their roots established, and horses are drawn to that lush new growth because it's a little sweeter and more sugary. So if you put the horses on it too soon, you're going to negate all of that hard work you did to get that pasture planted. As a final note, I want to do one quick reminder about using tall fescue in pastures. If you're managing a breeding farm, or you plan to have broodmares on your farm, you really want to avoid planting tall fescue in your broodmare pastures. While tall fescue is an excellent perennial pasture choice for most horses, it has an endophyte or fungus associated with it that causes reproductive problems in broodmares. Some of the problems that tall fescue can cause in our brood mares includes stillborn foals and agalactic mares, which means that the mares have no milk when the foals are born, as well as some other reproductive complications. So in general, it's best to minimize the mare's exposure to any type of fescue, whether it's grass or hay, in later gestation. Since tall fescue is one of our staples for horse pastures in Georgia, if you have broodmare pastures, you might consider using one of the novel endophyte varieties of fescue that have been developed. There are endophyte-free varieties, but these typically aren't a good idea because the endophyte actually helps the fescue grow. So in these endophyte-free varieties, they don't grow as well, and they'll typically be overtaken by endophyte-infected wild varieties that might be growing nearby. However, the novel endophyte varieties that have been developed are safely used in broodmare pastures. They do have an endophyte that works symbiotically to help the plant grow, but that endophyte doesn't produce the toxins that would cause those reproductive losses in broodmares. It's considerably more expensive, but it's definitely worth the money if you're considering establishing pasture for a band of broodmares. Hopefully this video gave you some helpful information on establishing a good horse pasture, including what types of grasses you might want to plant and the importance of rotational grazing. In our next video, which will be our final video of the series, we're going to give you some pointers on how to manage your pasture, including things like fertilizing, liming, and weed control. Thanks so much for tuning in with us, and thank you to the Georgia Equine Commodity Commission for funding this video series.